For 3 years Caleb Hawthorne had lived like a shadow. His little log cabin sat on the edge of the pines, far enough from town that people forgot to look for him. He kept to the land, meat from traps, berries in season, water from the creek, and the solitude suited the emptiness he carried. After Emily died, something in him closed. He told himself he didn't deserve another chance. It was easier to believe that than to risk feeling again. One cold morning, while he was splitting wood behind the cabin, a small voice interrupted the rhythm of his work. A little girl, ragged and thin, stood on the porch, looking as if she didn't know whether he was friend or threat. She said her mother couldn't walk. Caleb followed her through the trees to the creek and found the woman slumped against a tree, wounded and barely conscious. He carried her home, warmed her by the fire, tended the wound, and watched a life he'd tried to close off begin to press back in. The girl, Sophie, was fearless for her age, curious and relentless. The woman, Elsa McKinnon, was quiet at first, bruised in ways both visible and hidden. Caleb helped without asking questions. He watched them sleep, fed them what he had, and grew used to a voice and a small, busy presence in the cabin that pushed at the years of silence inside him. Sophie began to call him Daddy, before he corrected, and he did not. That simple name felt like a healing touch. Word moved slowly through the valley. Neighbors visited, gossiping and wary. An old woman named Edna, sharp and watchful, came by and left with her eyes full of judgment. Caleb began to feel the shift in how townsfolk looked at him and the strangers he sheltered. Then the truth spilled out. Elsa admitted she had been running from a violent man, Jonah McKinnon. He had been cruel to her and to Sophie. He would come looking. She feared, and she believed he'd kill to keep his ownership unquestioned. They prepared. Caleb hardened the cabin's defenses, learned to be on watch, set traps not for game but for men. The woods themselves felt dangerously small after that. One day a man on horseback scaled the ridge and scanned the trees like he was searching for someone. Another time Jonah himself appeared, lean, scarred, and smiling like a predator. He wanted Elsa back, claimed Sophie, and threatened violence. Caleb drew a line. When Jonah stepped too close, he paid for it with a gunshot to the shoulder. Elsa used the moment to break free, and together they brought Jonah back and tied him to a beam. What followed was a slow, agonizing unspooling of what Jonah had been, a confession under pressure. He revealed beatings, threats, and the use of influence and money to silence or erase women. He named accomplices. Caleb wrote it down and, with proof in hand, took it to Sheriff Ward, an honest man with reasons to hate Jonah. Arrests were made, some men resigned in disgrace, and for a moment it seemed like the law might do its work. But power in the valley had roots, and confession on paper wasn't enough to strip it out clean. Danger still lingered. The town reacted in fracturing ways. Some people turned blind eyes and mumbled curses, others welcomed the reckoning. Edna's gossip felt suddenly dangerous. Caleb suspected she'd not only talked about Elsa, but had pointed the wrong people toward their hiding place. Then violence crept in, and scraps of cloth nailed to trees, threats carved into bark, a rabbit pinned as a grotesque warning. Someone tried to burn Hazel Fielding's print shop, the young printer who'd published Elsa's story, and men began to take sides. Jonah's arrest did not end the menace. The wound festered. Jonah died in custody. Edna was later found poisoned. A deputy who'd resigned came to town drunk and raving, pulling a gun in the woods and swearing Caleb's name. Rumors swelled, and the pressure on Elsa and Sophie tightened. The family they were building at the cabin now carried the tension of being hunted. Caleb and Elsa argued about staying. She feared the cabin had become a trap, Somewhere Jonah had found them. He insisted it was home, and he was not yet ready to leave. Their differences were not just practical. Each had a different map for healing. One night, when fear and grief seemed to close around them, Elsa disappeared briefly to gather herself. She returned and, in a fragile moment, let the walls fall away. She wept openly, and they held each other. A letter arrived informing them Jonah had been buried quietly. The sheriff offered little detail, but worse things were happening farther out. Hiccups of violence and intimidation that suggested a larger, darker system of exploitation. Micah Glay, a man who had once been Caleb's closest friend, sent a short warning. Then Micah himself, gaunt hard, returned and told a worse story. Jonah had been only a hand in a much broader operation involving forged deeds, missing women, and a trade that preyed on the vulnerable. Micah had been implicated, fled, and now warned Caleb because the people who benefited from that corruption were still watching. Instead of running, Elsa chose to name what had been done. She and Caleb rode to Hazel and told every detail. The abuse, the cover-ups, the land fraud. Hazel printed the names and accusations. The town's reaction was immediate and violent. Flames consumed more than property. They tried to burn speech itself. Men cut the mule's tether. Bodies and threats appeared. Micah disappeared without trace. The pressure that had been building burst into open attempts to silence the truth. Caleb, Elsa, Sophie, and Hazel faced arson and threats the hard way with defense, with stubbornness, and with a public voice that wouldn't be quieted. The attackers came before dawn with torches. Caleb answered with gunfire and a chase into the trees. He found Hazel's print shop almost destroyed, but even as the enemy tried to intimidate, the story had already spread beyond the valley. Copies of the paper left town, names circulated, and local power failed to swallow the truth whole. When the worst of the direct threats subsided, the fallout kept coming in quieter forms: dead neighbors, a deputy spiraling into madness, people who chose to flee or to look away. But the telling had shifted something. Helpers arrived, hands with nails and lumber, to rebuild Hazel's press. People who had been silent began to step forward. Sheriff Ward arrested at least some of the guilty, and a few of the men who'd hidden behind money and favors were exposed. Life after that slow combustion was different. Elsa's pregnancy brought a new kind of hope, timid, fierce, and immediate. She and Caleb planned not to run but to build. They moved quietly to a small valley town, Lark's Hollow, where no one had the old grudges. They planted seeds in fresh soil. Caleb repaired roofs and fences. Elsa worked in the cafe and found the dignity in honest labor again. Sophie learned to trust laughter and lessons in kindness. The cabin that had once been a refuge from the world now felt like a starting point for something steadier. Not everything was erased. Micah's fate was never resolved. His body never found, and occasional shadows reminded them that the past leaves traces. But small rituals grew flowers at the base of a cottonwood where Micah's name was carved, Sunday walks in town, and the daily smallness of caring for children. Elsa gave birth to a daughter, Grace, and the new family settled into the quiet work of loving one another. Caleb felt redemption not as a dramatic pronouncement, but as a steadying change. He had breaths at his table, a child in his arms, a woman who trusted him. In town, people still whispered and judged, but more often now Caleb and his family passed through without flinching. Some called him fool, some called him miracle. He stopped caring which. He had found, by choice and stubbornness, a life that asked only for his presence. When nights came and old shadows crept in, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. He had a family, stubborn and human. who would face whatever came next with him. They had not erased the wrongs done to them or to others. They had not overturned every last secret. What they had built was simpler and harder, daily survival, the work of caring, and a refusal to let the past own their future. In the end, when a little girl once again called him Daddy, in a voice that trusted, Caleb opened the door, because years ago a child had opened his, and everything had finally changed.